So my name is Gina Chung, and I'm interviewing Dr. Frederick von Ende for the Voces Oral History Project in Brownsville, Texas at St. Joseph's Academy. Today is Sunday, April 2nd. And thank you. Just to make sure you understand, the interview will be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection. If there's something you don't want to talk about, you don't have to. And if there's something you want to talk about, please speak up. All right, so can you give me an overview of your life as it relates to the changes that came about as a part of the South Texas Border Initiative?
Changes that came about because of the Border Initiative?
And how it impacted your life?
Well, I was involved, I guess, in the beginning when I was asked to prepare a presentation or a report back in 1987. The presidents of the 5 state universities in South Texas were asked to get together to put together some sort of presentation to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to try to express what it was that they felt was lacking in higher education in South Texas. I was working at Pan American University at the time, and President Miguel Navarez asked me if I would attend this meeting of the 5 presidents, which I did, and they decided that I should put together the presentation for them. I think that's the way they put it. And they wanted to provide some background that would explain why we needed more resources in South Texas than we had. And so I don't want to cast any aspersions on them, but they didn't give me a whole lot of direction besides that. But I said, okay, they were going to pay me to do it, so I did it. I had that summer off. I think this happened in late April or May 1987, and I spent the summer doing this report. And what I had devised was a 3-part background check, background study, trying to look at the demographics of the South Texas area as compared to the rest of the state in terms of ethnicity, age, educational attainment, poverty, level of income, and things of that sort. Which I did most of that research in the Pan American Library using mostly census statistics. And then I worked on a second, what I called chapter or part, in which I compared the higher education opportunities in the South Texas border area with what was available in the rest of the state, focusing primarily on the variety of degrees available, the number of graduate degrees, graduate programs available, particularly doctoral programs, and professional programs like medical school or law school. As you can imagine, or maybe you don't, but this was the result. The demographic analysis showed that the majority of the population in the South Texas border area was Hispanic. At the same time, the evidence showed that the educational level of attainment was below the rest of the state. That the poverty level was higher, and sort of things like health and things of that sort also showed disparities between the South Texas area and the rest of the state. As far as higher education opportunities were available, people had to travel further in the South Texas to get to where there was graduate degrees or that they could deal with. Just as an example, there was only one doctorate in the whole South Texas border area at the time, and that was at Texas A&M, Texas A&I Kingsville, and it was a doctorate in bilingual education. There were no professional degrees available. And so we presented this evidence in this booklet, or I put in this booklet. I wrote a narrative out. And the idea was that this was going to be the background information for a presentation that the presidents were supposed to make for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board in July. Well, as July approached, I was told that they had postponed that presentation to October, but that I should continue working on it. So I did, and I made graphics, I made tables, I made charts and things like that illustrated the evidence that I was finding. And then I wrote an introduction to what I considered to be the third part, which was based on what we found in the first two parts, what do we think we need to create greater opportunities in South Texas? But as far as I know, the 5 presidents didn't get together again. Having worked for a couple different college presidents, I know that they tend to focus on the most immediate problems. Dr. Navarro always referred to it as putting out fires. And apparently they had other fires to deal with. The coordinating board apparently had lost some of its interest in getting this presentation done. So as August arrived, I was needing to get ready to go back to teach. And so I asked President Navarro, what should I do with this material I put together? He said, well, just write it up and send it to me. So I wrote the report that turned out to be this. It wasn't in this form yet, it was just a document. And I sent it to him and then went back to work as a teacher in the English department. Until late that year, I got a call from the president's secretary telling me that they were getting ready to print the report because they wanted to distribute it. And I said, wait a second, that report's not finished. I said, it ends in the middle of a sentence. And she said, well, let me talk to him. And she talked to the president, and he said, go ahead and finish it up anyway. They liked what it had in it, that it would be useful. And so I sent it over, and they asked me to write an executive summary. And since it was fairly long, the summary ended up being about 10 pages long. And so I said, okay, I sent it over to him. And the next thing I knew, this was printed and then sent out to people. As I understood it, it was sent to all of the legislators, all the Texas state legislators. I guess other education officials in the state. I know that eventually I got calls from Arizona, California, asking for copies of it. And I was really kind of embarrassed about it because it wasn't finished, because nobody had ever told me what they wanted to put in that third part. But I assumed that it was the statistical analysis that demonstrated that there were disparities between higher education in South Texas, particularly where the Hispanic population was heaviest, and the South Texas area and the rest of the state. So then I got contacted I guess it was maybe another, I don't know whether it was another year after that or what, but I got contacted by the people from MALDEF in San Antonio, telling me that they were interested in the report and wanted to know if they could use it in the lawsuit that was being filed on behalf of Hispanic students in South Texas against the state. And I was a little hesitant about that because it turned out that the university I worked for was one of the defendants. And so I wasn't real sure what my status was in that regard. I didn't know whether I would get fired or reprimanded or what if I was to deal with it. But I contacted Dr. Navarez and I said, listen, they want to use that report in this lawsuit. I said, and we're part of the defendants. And he said, go ahead and agree. Let them use it. Do what you can. He said, I think this is going to be a case where if we win, we lose. Or if we lose, we win, I guess is the way he put it. And so eventually, I don't remember all the details. I got notified that I was going to be involved in the lawsuit. I got subpoenaed, I guess is the word, to be deposed on it. Eventually, I came down to Brownsville for a court trial in the court of Gilberto Hinojosa. I don't remember the number of the court, but it was here in Brownsville. And I was nervous because I wasn't real sure what we were going to do. But during the trial, the lawyers from ALDEF, who included Norma Cantu, who was actually a graduate of Pan American, College, and then Al Kaufman, who was one of the lawyers from ALDEF. They were the ones who presented me, and my concern with them was that they presented me as an expert on higher education. And I thought that might be a bit of an exaggeration because I have a PhD in medieval English literature, and they were wondering what in the world I was doing. The court was testifying about higher education. But he said, and he showed evidence from the book and so on. And then I got cross-examined by one of the assistant attorney generals of Texas, state of Texas, since the state was one of the defendants in the case. I think his name was Kevin O'Hanlon. I don't know what ever happened to him, but he was tough on me. He started off by asking me about my statistical expertise. He asked me if I had a doctorate in statistical analysis, and I said, no, sir, I have a PhD in medieval English literature. And he looked like, what are you doing up there? Then he said, well, did you take courses in statistical analysis in your doctoral program? I said, no. I did a little bit of statistical analysis, but I was doing a technical analysis of 4 medieval poems, in which I was looking at their rhyme schemes and things of that sort. But it was just, what did I find there? Then he said, do you have any, did you major in statistics in your undergraduate degree? I said, no, I was an English major. And he kept kind of boring down on how little statistical experience I had. And at some point he finally asked me, so why do you think people should accept what you've done as evidence, of a disparity in the resources? And I said, well, it seems so obvious. I said one of the things that I had found in the statistics was that there was one doctorate available in the South Texas area, the one I talked about at Texas A&M, Texas A&I Kingsville, and there were 400 available in the North Texas area around Dallas. And they said, well, where did you get that evidence? I said, from the coordinating board. It was in their reports. I said, all I did was go in and count them. And again, he said, why should we pay any attention to your analysis? I said, well, it seems so obvious to me. I mean, it's obvious to an English teacher. It ought to be obvious to anybody. And I remember, at least I believe I remember, Judge Hinojosa was over at the bench going, and that made me feel good. But by the time that phase of the trial was over, I felt like I could walk out under the door without opening it, because they had made me seem so small. But the Maldeaf people thought I had done fine. So, and then later, I was asked to, or I don't know whether I was asked or whether I got to testify before a higher education committee at the state legislature. And I just basically talked about some of the things that were in the report that I had written. I remember specifically Senator Carl Parker from Beaumont, who I think was probably the chair of the committee, but I'm not sure. But again, I was pretty nervous. This is not something an English teacher is trained to do. But he asked me what it was that I wanted. And I said, well, I wanted what everybody else wanted down in South Texas, more higher education opportunities. We thought that would improve everything across the board if we could get that. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said, well, what if we gave you this? Then would you be satisfied? And I remember that I said, Senator Parker, I'm an English teacher. I would never admit to being satisfied with anything. There's always room for improvement. I don't think he really liked that. And that's the last I remember about that. But I guess doing that ended up getting me more involved in the university's administration. And so it did affect my life, particularly in that way. I had gone down to the Valley to teach at Pan American College as an English teacher, but in the course of that, I got involved in university or college service. I had been on the faculty senate. I was chairman of the faculty senate for 3 times, and so I had worked fairly closely with the president, Dr. Schilling at the time, who was a fairly gruff man. He was a very big man. He was an ex-professional football player. He was about 6'4" and weighed over 300 pounds. And he was intimidating for many of the faculty members. But when I went on to the faculty senate, which he didn't particularly like, we met in an obscure room that seemed to be hidden away from everything. And the chairman of the faculty senate, when I first went on, kept saying, we shouldn't take that up, the president wouldn't like it. And I thought that was kind of chicken. And so I said that a couple times. The next thing I knew, I was chairman, which I'm not real sure I really wanted to be chairman, but I was. And it seemed to me that at the end of each faculty senate meeting after that, they would pass a resolution saying the chairman of the faculty senate will go talk to the president about this particular issue. And so I was over there quite a bit. And as I said, he was a fairly gruff fellow. He had a low voice, and the secretary would go in and tell him I was there, and I'd hear, I don't know whether I'm allowed to say these things, God damn it, what does he want this time? And then I'd go in and I'd talk to him, and we got along fairly well. He kept telling me that everything we kept asking for was stuff that they had dealt with years before, and it kept coming back up and so on. But I said, well, they passed a resolution for me to come talk to you about it. And it wasn't too long after that that I got a call from the president's office to come and join his office for a year because the Board of Regents we had at the time, we weren't part of the University of Texas system, didn't have a real manual to go by. They just had a couple of mimeograph sheets of bylaws, and they wanted an actual board manual, and so they asked me to write that. And so I researched a lot of things in the state of Texas and beyond, and I wrote a board manual. And by the time I finished it, they had some other things they wanted me to do, and so I stayed on in this, what was supposed to be a temporary administrative position, for 4 years. During the last of those years, Dr. Schilling had decided to retire. He was being pressured. This is at the time when Texas was changing from a Democratic majority state to a Republican majority state. And the Republicans were taking over, and I don't think they liked Dr. Schilling very much. But they needed to have someone help them, I guess, run the presidential search. And so I got asked to do that. And the result of that was that Dr. Miguel Nevares was named the new president. And when he became president, then I asked to go back to full-time teaching. That was about 1980 or 81, I guess. And then about halfway through that, we were involved in our institutional self-study, which is how we get our accreditation. And the person who was supposed to be writing the self-study, the editor, was one of President Navarro's closest friends and personal advisors. His name was Daniel Alvides, and unfortunately he had a heart attack and died. And so President Navarro called me and said, can you step in and be the editor for the self-study? So I did, and so we got that done. And then I went back to teaching again, and then I got another call from the president because the English department was having some civil war. All English departments constantly have civil war. But the person who was the chair of the department at the time needed to be removed, and they didn't want anybody who was already involved to do it. And so he asked me to be the department chairman. I said, well, I've already been department chairman. I didn't really want to do that again. I'm not that inclined to do administrative work. And he said, well, just do it for this one semester, which I did. So then I got back to teaching, which again was my preference. And then he called me and said, now that we're involved in the University of Texas system, because we had done the merger, he said, we have to have a strategic planning committee. I want you to be on it, and I want you to be the chair of it. I said, okay, and so I started being the chairman of the strategic planning committee, and the administrative officer that we were supposed to work with, who was the director of the Office of Institutional Research and Planning, who was from down here, from the University of Texas, from Brownsville. He decided he wanted to go back to Brownsville after only, I guess, a semester. And so there was nobody in that office, and all of a sudden we had reports due to the state and to the UT system on our strategic plans. And so, again, I was asked to take a temporary position in the administration, in the office of the president. This was supposed to be half-time for one semester. Then it turned out to be three-quarter time for another semester, and then it turned out to be full-time for 12 years. And again, I had never once in my life applied for an administrative position. That wasn't what I wanted to do. But I became the director of institutional research and planning, and that job eventually evolved into executive director of the Office of Institutional Effectiveness. I was the university's chief planning officer, I guess chief assessment officer, and in that process I also became responsible for our university's involvement in the South Texas Border Initiative. And so I would have to go to meetings on that. I would have to write reports on our progress in the South Texas Border Initiative. So I have to say that most of my involvement in the South Texas Border Initiative, although it was rewarding, was all kind of accidental. It wasn't something that I went out and sought to do. I am proud of what happened because of it. But as I said, I think it was mostly accidental, and eventually, after 12 years in the office of the president, I asked again, I said, can I go back? And I'm getting fairly close to the end of my teaching career here, and I'd like to finish as an English teacher. That's what I came to be. And so they said, okay. Now, whether it had any effect or not, I don't know. President Navarez then decided to step down a year later. But that's how it affected my life. In particular, I learned the road to Austin a lot better than I ever had before. I used to have other people saying, boy, you've got a really cool job. You get to go travel to Austin all the time. I said, yeah, you go up there, check into a hotel, you go down to the state capitol, and you stand around for hours and hours, and then you go back to the hotel, and a couple days later you drive home. It's not that exciting. But I did learn a good bit about the political side of higher education. I mean, my background had all been in English, a very academic side, but I learned more about finance and buildings and all kinds of other things that that really made me understand the whole complexity of higher education better. I'm sorry, that's a really long answer.
No, that was great. So I want to talk a little bit about your childhood and your growing up and how this led into your involvement. So I'm just going to ask you, what was your childhood like?
I think very ordinary. I was born in Pittsburgh, where my parents were, but almost immediately started moving south, and that process has continued through most of my life. We moved almost soon after I was born to West Virginia, to Bethany, where my father taught, and then we moved to North Texas, to Texas State College for Women in Denton. That's Texas Women's University now. Matter of fact, that's where I started my education. I went to a demonstration school at TSCW. So I tell alumni from there that I went to school there too. I fudge a little bit on that, but and then we moved to Abilene, where my father taught at McMurray College. I went to public schools in Abilene. I had to walk to school, had to cross a creek to get, my wife's laughing at me. It was only about 200 yards and the creek was almost always dry, but I still walked. I went to Davy Crockett Elementary School, which was a brand new school that was across the street from where we lived. I went to South Junior High School in Abilene and then to Abilene High. I did not like high school. We were a very overcrowded high school. And we had to go in shifts from very early in the morning till after dark at night. I think I was in the early morning shift. So I don't have any real pleasant memories of high school because of, I guess, the way high school was. I wasn't really involved in much extracurricular activities. I was in the band in junior high, but I couldn't play very well. So I was not invited to continue in high school. My father was a music teacher, so I'm sure I was a disappointment in that my musical talent was very limited. But then I started working. I worked when I was a boy. I had a paper route. We didn't get an allowance when I was growing up, but any money we earned away from the house was ours to keep. And although we had a lot of chores to do, those chores were limited if we were working outside the home. So it didn't take very long before you learned, go get a job, you know, and you get that money. So I worked as a paper boy. I had a paper route. Then I went to work I had odd jobs. I painted houses, and I picked pears. I'm sure I did some yard work. But then I went to work in the grocery store. And worked in the grocery store all the way through high school and through college. In fact, when I was graduating from college, I was offered an opportunity to go into a managerial training program with the grocery store chain that I worked at. But I didn't really want to be a grocery store manager. I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I went to college in Abilene. I went to the school where my parents taught. My father was the head of the fine arts department. My mother was a ceramics teacher. And when I went to college, I don't know, I guess I must have decided, I don't remember any great epiphany or anything, but I must have decided I'm going to do this more seriously. I didn't have to do very much in high school. And so I focused a lot more. I still worked. I worked at the grocery store, and I worked as a student aide to the foreign language teacher, or one of the foreign language teachers. I became involved in one of the social organizations. I edited the school literary magazine. I was the president of the English honor fraternity, Sigma Tau Delta, and I eventually did some stuff in student government. And I guess a lot of that led to, I got a fellowship to work on a doctorate to Texas Christian University. And so that's the progression. But I don't think of anything as being very unusual about my growing up. My family expanded our little house, doubled the size of it, doing most of the work ourselves. My father was the builder, and my brothers and I were the labor. And I guess I learned from that. I liked building things. I liked making things. I continue that to this day as I do woodworking. I have done a lot of the remodeling at our present house myself. But again, I don't think of anything as being very, out of the ordinary in my growing up.
So what influenced your decision to become a professor at University of Texas Pan American?
I think not knowing anything else to do. I decided my first day in college to be an English major. Everybody assumed that I was going to be a teacher. Everybody except me. My parents were both teachers, and I didn't think I wanted to be. So I majored in English. I minored in foreign language, primarily because of the foreign language teacher. I got the fellowship, and in fact, the fellowship that I had was intended to increase the number of people gaining doctorates in the arts. It was actually called a national defense scholarship. It guaranteed me 3 years, of tuition and fees and so on. And so I went to Texas Christian University. I still didn't have the idea that I was going to be a teacher, but when you're in the graduate program, and particularly in something like English, there's not a whole lot of other job prospects out there, professional job prospects. And as a graduate student, you kind of eventually make your way around to the other side of the desk. And before I knew it, I was a teacher. And then when it was time to start looking for a more permanent position, I taught, after I finished my fellowship, I taught a year at TCU as an instructor while I did most of the research on my doctorate, on my dissertation. But then I was applying for jobs, and two friends of mine who I had known at TCU had come down to Pan American College. And so they encouraged me to apply there. And I was offered a job that looked pretty good because they didn't have a lot of teachers with either advanced degrees or close to advanced degrees. They were trying to build that part of their program because they wanted to become a university. And so I told my wife that we'll go down to the valley for 1 year or two, and then we'll go someplace else. And so she agreed with that. And so 42 years later, I said, I'm going to retire now. And we never did leave. But I was able to, I really enjoyed teaching, I found out. I got to do much of what I wanted to because there was nobody else in medieval literature. So I got to create courses. I got to pretty much plan my own schedule. As I said already, I got involved in the service side of the university, and so I got to be on a lot of committees and the faculty senate, and then a couple of administrative jobs. I was department chair once, and then I was department chair again by accident. But I had a marvelous time. The students were good. I always felt like the students that I got to teach at Pan American benefited more from their education than the ones that I had at Texas Christian University. I don't know that those that I taught at TCU changed their social standing or things like that very much. We used to joke about the fact that you could tell the difference between the student parking lots and the faculty parking lots and the graduate student parking lots, because the students all had really new cars and the faculty had, and the graduate students either had no cars or really run down things. But you know, the majority of the students that I taught at Pan American were first generation students. They truly benefited from it. They would go from families that were very poor to families that were at very least middle class, and who had professional opportunities. So it was a rewarding kind of experience.
I received a tip from your wife that you taught an interesting class about Harry Potter in the last 3 years. Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, I enjoyed creating new classes. So I had created classes in Chaucer and medieval drama and Milton and various other things. But then when I had returned to teaching in my last years before I retired, well, my daughters had been reading the Harry Potter books, and so I felt like I should read them just to see what the big deal was, because they seemed to really enjoy them. And I'm sure you all know about Harry Potter, but the first book was, half an inch thick, and the last one was probably 3 inches thick. They kept growing and growing. And yet people were standing in line. Children were standing in line to read these books. And it really intrigued me. And so I read them. And in reading them, I became fascinated with the way the characters in the story grow. You could see really definite patterns in the way J.K. Rowling designed her stories. they all follow the same basic pattern, but then the characters grow and grow and grow. And I said, this would be a good class, a good thing to teach, to show how literature, how authors develop things. And so I wrote up a proposal. We had a course called Special Topics that would allow you to teach various things that weren't part of the normal curriculum. And when I presented it, the committee said, are you going to do this as an undergraduate or as a graduate? I said, well, how about both? And they said, okay. And so I did, and I offered the course, and it was a sellout. I mean, having taught medieval literature, which is not the most popular thing in the world, you don't find a lot of people banging on your door to say, can I take your Chaucer course? But this one they did. I mean, I had people begging to get in it. I wasn't sure how to deal with that. But I taught it, and it was a lot of fun, because my experience had not been that you could expect the whole class to have read the lesson when you went to class. Boy, this time they knew more than I did about these books. And so it was fun. We made it a fairly challenging class. Not only did they have to come to class every time, but we had extra sessions every week. We showed the movies that were available, and then we discussed how they matched the book. And then they had research projects that they had to do, and then they had an opportunity to present these research projects. And so I had students doing this fairly early on, PowerPoint presentations on the Harry Potter characters and things of that sort. So it was just a really fun teaching experience for me. Matter of fact, we're about to go on a trip to England later this month, and one of the things we're going to do is to go to the Warner Brothers studio to see the things there. But I just downloaded onto my iPad that I do most of my reading on now. I just downloaded all of the Harry Potter books because I thought, well, I need something to read while I'm there. I'll read them again. So I didn't want to read the ones I have. I didn't want to carry the ones I have at home. Plus, they have these little yellow papers stuck to almost every page. So, no, that was a good experience.
Could you tell me a little bit about your wife? How did you guys meet?
We met at college. Actually, we're said to have met when we were younger. Catherine's father was a Methodist minister, and the college that I went to was a Methodist-supported college. And for a period of time, he was the minister at the church that first met at the college and then built a church right across the street. And so they tell us that we probably did meet when we were, 6 or 7 or 8? Well, no, it'd have to be 8 or 9. Then I started college in 1960. I guess I was a junior. I had just come back from a summer at Breadloaf Writers Conference in Vermont and some time in New York and Western Massachusetts. And school was starting for my junior year, and I heard that one of my club brothers' twin sisters had come to college, and so I got to meet them. Catherine and Carolyn, identical twins. And so for our first date, I asked them both out. This is my interpretation, not my wife's. And we went to a Chinese restaurant and had coffee, I think, which is about as much as I could afford. And then, well, Catherine appealed to me a whole lot more than Carolyn did. And so we started dating. I think she refers to another date we had as our first date. But as I explained to her, I paid for the coffee, so it was a date, even if it was both sisters. And then we pretty much stayed together. She broke up with me once because she wanted to date some guy named Herschel. This is my interpretation. But we got married almost just right after I graduated. Matter of fact, we had set our wedding date for August the 1st, and we realized that both of us would have to quit our jobs. We were about to leave to go so I could go to graduate school, and we didn't have very much money. So we postponed our wedding date 2 weeks. There's a story. Her father was going to be the one who married us because he was the minister, and he had put our wedding date in his appointment book in ink. It was the first thing he'd ever put in there in ink, and we had to change it. So he put the time. Second time it was in pencil, but we did get married, and then we went off to Fort Worth. And went to graduate school. We lived in an apartment, a university apartment there in Fort Worth. Catherine worked for the music department as a secretary, and I went to graduate school. So it was one of the lucky parts of my life to run into her. I get along with her twin sister much better now than back then, because she now lives down here too. But we've been married for 52 years. I got a clue. I was going to say 53. Because time flies when you're having fun.
What were your guys' first impression and when you guys moved to the South Texas region?
I think the first impression was that, are you sure there's anything down here? Because once you get past San Antonio, then you get out into the ranch country, and it is scrub brush and mesquite. And we had, growing up in Abilene, we didn't have a whole lot of nice foliage or anything like that. But we had been in Fort Worth for 4 years, and it does have trees and all kinds of things. And we drove down here, and there's like 4 hours south of San Antonio where doesn't appear to be anything that can support, life. When we got to Pan American College, it consisted of like 7 one-story buildings, and we had come from TCU, which had, very nice campus and so on. We sure about this? But the experience of working there was very great, and it was growing. I don't think I'm solely responsible for its growth, but it grew a whole lot while I was there, so I had to have done something. But now the campus is huge. They're always building something new. We now have a new medical school that we didn't have before. And so it's had a major impact on the area. But our first impression was this is going to be tough, but it turned out to be good.
All right, so moving on to your involvement with higher education in South Texas. So you mentioned it briefly earlier, but what caused you to look into the disparities in the availability of advanced degree programs for higher education in South Texas?
Well, I think the fact that those 5 presidents wanted me to do that, wanted me to, develop a report, and that seemed to be the way for me to do it. It was one of those things that everybody that I knew that the resources and the degree programs and things of that sort were not comparable in the South Texas area to what they were in the rest of the state. The same thing was true with things like highway development and other state programs for the area. It didn't have the political power, it didn't have the economic power and so on in the South Texas area to cause the state to look at that area. And it's to us particularly true with trying to get more higher education resources. And in that we mean both programs and resources like library and buildings and so on. And I think one of the things that happened because of the report is that it put it down in ways that people could understand, that these are the characteristics of the people who live in this area, and these are the statistics that show what kind of higher education resources they have. And there was a general feeling that if we can raise these resources, the lives of the people who lived here would be better.
What were some of the disparities or differences that you felt that you saw with your college experience and then the students that you taught at UT Pan American?
Well, just as an example, I think I knew from the first time I went to college that graduate study was an option beyond, or professional degrees were an option beyond. I knew that even as an undergraduate, if I had wanted to major in something, I could pick a school where it was available. And that didn't turn out for me because I was pretty much limited to the college where my father taught. But I knew that they were available, that within reasonable distance. What was true here was that for the vast majority of our students, I think, they were the first to go to college. Their families couldn't really afford it. Luckily, about the same time, financial aid became more available. Many of the veterans coming back from the Vietnam War had the GI Bill to go to school on. And so they were beginning to get those opportunities, but they were limited. We became a university in 1971, and I forget how long it was before we got our first doctorate. But I remember it being difficult trying to get our programs approved by the coordinating board. And there was also a good bit of rivalry among the institutions in South Texas because we didn't really get together to present a unified front. And I think that was one of the efforts that this booklet was supposed to help do. But I know that early on, as I was an advisor for English majors, and I would discover students that I knew or took my classes that I thought would benefit by going on to higher levels. And frequently the response was, I can't, because I'd have to go someplace else, and my family can't afford it. And one of the responses that always impressed me a lot was that students would say, I'd say, you ought to go on and get a master's or maybe a doctorate. And they say, I have to let my siblings go first. I can't just keep on going while they're, not being able to go at all. So they would go home, they would graduate and go to work, many of them as teachers, and then help put their brothers and sisters through. But with the South Texas Initiative, we began to add a lot of programs like engineering, more science programs, and more master's and eventually doctoral programs where they didn't have to travel so far. I think at one point they had to go 250 miles to get to where a doctoral program was available. So that sort of thing is what I experienced.
So you did summarize your report earlier, so I wanted to ask you a few more questions about the report. I read from your report that you based it on statistics and findings from sources including federal agencies such as the U.S. Bureau of Census. And so what were some of the things that you were careful of or mindful about when you were putting together the report?
Mostly that I had some sort of evidence for, I don't want to say that I had already come to a conclusion before I started, but it was pretty obvious that the people in the valley weren't as wealthy. They didn't have as much education, and so I looked for things where I could back up what I had to say with statistics that were not things that I made up, but things that I could find in official reports. That's one of the reasons I went to the census, and I also went to the metropolitan statistical areas, because they became the best kind of comparative using those. And I think there are like 26 or 27 in Texas, and we had in the South Texas area, Corpus Christi, Brownsville, Harlingen, McAllen, Edinburgh, and then out to El Paso. And they made it very easy to compare certain elements. So I've already told you I don't have any background in statistical analysis, but the stuff I found was so obvious. The level of educational attainment was so much lower in the valley than it was in the rest of the state. And they weren't my statistics; they were the ones I found. So I think I was just trying to provide some credible evidence for what everybody already seemed to know.
What would you say was the most intriguing piece of information that you came across while you were gathering together the evidence for the report?
I think it was the discrepancy in the number of doctorates. I had no idea. I knew there weren't any at our school. At that time, there weren't any really other places in South Texas except for the one at Kingsville. But when I started looking at the coordinating board's evidence, and I think they were very proud of how many, just as an example of this, North Texas has dozens of doctoral degrees in music. So you can get a doctoral degree in music in cornet and trumpet and trombone, and But they counted each one of those as a separate doctorate. And so when I started counting up what was available, and it turned out that there were 400 in the Dallas, Fort Worth, North Texas area, and one where we were, I said, you can't deny that kind of evidence. And somebody said, well, that's not really true. We don't have that many doctorates. I said, well, the coordinating board says, that they asked me, where did you get that evidence? I said, from the coordinating board. And it was almost as if they didn't want to admit that that was true.
So, as you said, you mentioned in your report that there were, quote, like, no institutions with multiple doctoral degree programs in counties where Hispanics are concentrated. So what inspired you to look at this issue from the issue of race?
Well, one of the things that was pretty clear to anybody who lived in the South Texas area was that the Hispanic population was the majority population. And you know, I could look out in my classes. The majority of the students in my classes were Hispanic. The people who lived in our neighborhood were Hispanic. The people you ran into at the grocery store were Hispanic. And so it was obvious from the time I first went to work at Pan American that the majority of my students were Hispanic. I remember working very hard at learning to pronounce the names properly so that when I called the roll the first day in class, I wasn't doing, you know, like Villarreal and Gonzalez and things like that. And I would go to, like, our secretary who was Hispanic. I said, help me with this. I want to make sure that I'm saying it as well as possible. So, you know, it's not something you ignore. It's there. It didn't take me long before I found ways of incorporating the nature of our students into some of my assignments, so that like in my freshman composition classes, I would have students writing definition essays on Spanish words that were migrating into English, so that they would show up in English publications, but as Spanish words like barrio and things of that sort. And so it was a fact of life. Some of the people I was working with, one of my, I guess, closest associates when I first went to work for Dr. Schilling was the assistant to the president, Homer Pena, who eventually became president of the school in Brownsville. So, you know, I respected them. I enjoyed my time working for Miguel Navarez. I guess I wouldn't have stayed with him for 12 years if I hadn't. But it was, I guess I wanted to do my part to help improve the lots of the people I lived with. So,
how would you say that your race or ethnicity factored into your experience?
Well, I knew that I was not Hispanic, but I had been around Hispanics certainly before I came here. Two of the people that I worked with at the grocery store, in fact, the two that I think I admired the most because they worked harder than anybody else were Hispanic. One was Ben Gonzalez, who eventually became a store manager after he had been passed over more times than he deserved. That he was a really nice, hardworking person. And Chico Perez, who was just a very hardworking person who seemed to be, I don't know, teased or discriminated against or whatever. So that was back in Abilene. And so and I don't think of myself as a civil rights person by any means. When I first went to McMurray College, it was pretty much segregated. There were a few Hispanic students. There was one black student, and he was the first. I guess I had enough civil rights urge in me to be part of a boycott of a drugstore across the street that wouldn't let Morris Baker eat there. And it worked. We got them to quit doing that. So I've never had any problems with multiple ethnic peoples.
Why do you think it was important for your voice to be heard on this issue?
I don't know that it was important for my voice to be heard. I'm glad it was. I think I was picked for the responsibility of doing this report because I had worked with the administration before and I had produced when they wanted something produced. And so I guess I was reliable. Dr. Navarez had depended on me before, and this was another case of that. It certainly had more impact than I expected it to in the beginning.
So what do you think was the biggest impact that your report had?
I don't know to what extent it was responsible, along with the lawsuit that Maldef filed, of which mine was apparently some fairly significant evidence, that it made the legislature start paying more attention to the South Texas area, and the lawsuit was eventually reversed. The plaintiffs won here in Brownsville, but the verdict was eventually overturned. But by the time it was overturned, the legislature was actually beginning to develop what turned out to be the South Texas Border Initiative. And they began to provide more money for degree development, for building development, and so on, for scholarships and so on, for the South Texas area. And that has, in my mind at least, continued from that time on. We were 3,000 students when I went down to Pan American in 1968. And recently I think we were pretty close to 30,000. And so the need was there. We just had to make more opportunities available so we could handle more of the students. During the time that all this was going on, they started a community college in South Texas, which is now called South Texas College. I was in the planning office at the time, and although many people expected us to oppose the community college, that it would take away from our students, we predicted that it would actually add students in the long run, that it would probably surpass us because it broadened the base of higher education while we were trying to extend the height of higher education. And that has turned out to be the case. South Texas College now enrolls far more than 30,000, and we're right close to that. So we've more than doubled together what has become available. I think a lot of it is that change of attitude that South Texas deserves to have more higher education resources.
So when you heard that the ruling will be overturned, how did you feel?
Well, I was sad. I thought that there was a pretty good case, but I think what the general outcome of that was that the suit had been based on the idea that Mexican Americans in South Texas were discriminated against on the basis of ethnicity. The court eventually ruled that yes, there was disparity, but it wasn't because of intentional discrimination. So in the long run, it didn't make a whole lot of difference because the impact of it was to make more resources available.
And so what was the response from the public to your report? Did you get any criticism?
The only responses I got were from MALDEF, which liked it a whole lot, from a few legislators who said, you know, this is what we needed as evidence. I don't know that the public ever knew about it, the general public. As I said, I did get some calls from Arizona and California wanting copies of it, but that's I think for the most part it was hidden. Even as just about the time I retired, I went by the president's office and there was a shelf of them sitting up there, and I have no idea what they did with. I suppose they shredded them or took them to the recycling or something. I used to joke about the fact that there are lots of reports that I wrote that were shelved someplace, and that's just part of it. You know, you don't hit a home run every time.
Did your students know about your working on the report? Did you have talk with them about it?
Eventually, I did. I told students, you know, that I had participated in this. I don't know that it meant a whole lot to some of them. I taught technical report writing as one of the things I taught, and one of the things that we always emphasized in that course was writing up the results of a statistical analysis. And so we sometimes used some of the same data that I had in this report and that I had found other places, and said, okay, how would you explain that to someone? You know, that's the point of, you can't just put the statistics out there, you have to explain what they say. And so, you know, those students knew about it.
And so in the report you mentioned that you left it unfinished. Do you think it's necessary for another report to be done on higher education in South Texas today and continue your work?
I think it might be beneficial. I think one of the things it would show is that what I thought was going to be asked in that third part has actually happened. We have a lot more graduate degrees now. We have a lot more, well, at UTRGV now. We have a lot more engineering, science courses because the resources you have to support those are much greater than for English, for instance. We have now a medical school. There's continuing talk of a law school. It's just the difference between what was available back then and what's available now is significant. And perhaps somebody needs to go in and say, here's what we had then, here's what we have now, let's keep going.
And what motivates you to keep this case relevant?
I live in the Valley. I've retired. A lot of people ask me, when you retire, where are you going to go? I say, I'm going to go here. This is where I live. This is where my house is. This is where my children were born. This is where I worked most of my life. I like the Valley. And so I wanted to continue to get better. And as an educator, I believe that one of the main ways you get better is by having more education. So I don't think that'll ever quit being something that motivates me.
And what were the main lessons that you learned from this experience?
I think sometimes the information is there, you just have to present it. As I said, I don't think I was surprising anyone with the information that I found. What it did was confirm what they already knew and felt. And so I think sometimes it's just a question of gathering the information you need to support the point you're trying to make.
And how do you feel about the current status of the universities in the border region?
I think they're a lot better than they were when I came. I think they probably will continue to get better. I think South Texas, sometimes for the wrong reasons, but many times for the right reasons, is getting more attention from the state than it used to. And I think some of that comes from what happened because of the South Texas Border Initiative. And the fact that as a part of all of that, the university I was involved with became part of the University of Texas system. And that has meant a lot to the people in the Valley. The other schools became part of Texas A&M. And since those two systems tend to be kind of rivals, as everybody knows, Texas A&M is now opening a campus in McAllen. So I think what people are saying is there's a lot of people down there. There's still a lot of scrub brush between San Antonio and the Valley, but the Valley itself is growing rapidly. It's the McAllen Mission Edinburgh Metropolitan Statistical Area is either the 7th or the 6th largest metropolitan area in the state. And I suspect that most of the people who live in the Valley wouldn't know that, but it's true because it's made up of so many smaller communities. It doesn't seem as big as like Lubbock or Waco or places like that, but it's much bigger than they are. So it's I think just making everybody more aware of what's here.
And which of those changes gave you the biggest hope for future change?
Well, I think as an educator, getting more advanced degrees available so that people can go beyond the bachelor's degree without having to leave the area they live in.
And what might be a future change that you hope to see very soon?
Well, I'm looking forward to the first of the students at the medical school graduating. I think eventually we will get a law school someplace in the Valley. I'm not entirely sure we need a whole lot more lawyers, but that is one of the professional degrees. I've got at least one niece that's going to law school, and maybe another, a nephew. So, again, the more opportunities there are, I think the better things are.
And which of your accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, combined with that lady back there, I guess our daughters.
Could you tell me a little bit about your daughters?
Well, the older one, both daughters ended up going to the same college that we went to McMurray. The older daughter started off as a teacher. She taught high school, and then she taught elementary school. She got her master's degree in English while she was doing that. But then I think her greatest love was working with youth at the church. And she has been, how many years now? 17 years at Ridgewood Park United Methodist Church. She's gone through 6 or 7 or 8 ministers, but she's the kind of the rock of the place. My younger daughter is also a teacher. She's a special ed teacher. Having been a teacher myself, I admire the patience and the stamina and whatever else it is that it takes to be a special ed teacher. I think I would probably last less than 30 minutes. But she seems to enjoy it a whole lot and seems to be effective. Both of them do. So we're proud of what they've done.
And when are you happiest?
Probably when I'm reading.
Which of the books that you read have been really influential in your life?
Well, probably all of them. I'm a really big fan of the King Arthur stories. My doctoral dissertation, one of the poems that I worked on is involved in that, Sir Gawain the Green Knight. I have liked the stories of knighthood and chivalry since I was a boy. So I made the study of the King Arthur stories kind of a specialty. One of the things we're going to do this summer, this spring when we go on our trip to England, is to go back to a place called Tintagel. It's an obscure little village on the west coast of England that doesn't even have bus service. But there's a castle there which is supposed to be the birthplace of King Arthur, and I like going there. I'm particularly fascinated with Stonehenge, which has been incorporated into the Arthurian story. I just happen to like those stories. I guess one of my favorite books is The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is his retelling of the Arthurian story. So,
and how has your thinking evolved over the years?
well, I'm not sure how to answer that.
Or how have your feelings changed over time on certain ideas or...
Well, I think I've always been sort of liberal, and so I don't think that that's changed a whole lot. I grew up in a family of teachers, and we never had a whole lot of money. And then I went into a profession that doesn't create a whole lot of money, so money's never been a really big thing. We don't have a really fancy house. It's a nice solid house that wouldn't move much in any earthquake. But we're not a gated community. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but one of my daughters once asked me, why couldn't you have been a real doctor? Because she had been to visit some friends who lived in a much fancier house. I said, well, they have to deal with blood and stuff like that. I didn't want to. I don't know that my feelings have changed a whole lot, or still love the same woman.
Did you see any changes in yourself after working with the South Texas Border Initiative?
I think I became more sensitive to the disparity that existed. I didn't go out necessarily and protest things or anything like that. That hasn't been my nature. I've always felt like if you can just fix things that are right around you, you do your part. So.
All right, and is there anything else you'd like to add?
Anything I need to add? Well, I'm glad you're doing this. I have read about oral history projects and so on. I know some have been conducted down in the valley, but I think this is the first I've been involved in. So I appreciate you all going to this effort, and I hope it develops and continues to go on.
What are some ideas you have of why maybe this Latino experience has been taken out of, normal history or like in our normal rhetoric?
I think because for a long time the Hispanic population has not been great enough in the northern part of the state and the country to have made that much of an impact. It's certainly doing so now. There is more Spanish in the English language than there used to be. There is certainly more Mexican cuisine in the society than there used to be. You can look at ads now that where before everybody was white, and now they're people of color in advertisements. It's obvious that progress is being made in a cultural way. We've had it for years down where we live, and so it's like it's time the rest of the world woke up.
All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you.